Adis, let me then ask you also then. So what you talked a little bit about kind of your own archival kind of impulses and how you did. So now once you're helping out with this thing at the Oakland Museum, like what are you thinking about that you have to make sure that you do? Obviously, they're bringing you in because they want to make sure that it's legit, that it's your BS meter, and other people are not going to let it be whacked. So, what's first and foremost in your mind about the balance of and kind of like what Eric was talking about too, is like how do you present it so that it's respectful, but it's not boring, it's not stiff, because that's really because it's
No, I mean, it's also important for me to note that, like, this is doing this show, Respect at the Oakland Museum is a thing that I put together with Susan Barrett, who she and I were working together in St. Louis at the World Chess Hall of Fame. That's how we met. She was the director at the World Chess Hall of Fame, and so we knew when we did the show in St. Louis, and this was during the Ferguson Uprising, which was off the chain. We knew that there was more to it, but the World Chess Hall of Fame, they liked the idea of hip hop and chess, but they were also pretty scared of it. And it was, because of everything that was happening in Ferguson, in some ways they were afraid that black people were going to come and just like Molotov the spot and then leave. But I was like, look, you're documenting a lot of positive things about hip hop, black males and females. They're going to be happy. Chill out. And so it worked. So now we're bringing it here. And we're doing it better and bigger. And everybody at the Oakland Museum so far has just been really amazing. Coming back from Cornell and everything, I started thinking about my own collection. I started thinking about like, all right, so I guess I got to give my stuff to Columbia or Cornell or somebody, because I can't keep all these posters rolled up in my parents' closet on the top in this tube, right? For me, I think more than anything, it is not important that we document hip-hop history. It's important that we document hip-hop history in a historic manner, right? What stories have not been told? Let's talk about that. What photos have not been seen? Let's talk about that. Like, I run the Hip Hop Chess Federation, and I teach chess and jiu-jitsu at Zaytuna College up the road, and I do all this different stuff with martial arts and hip hop. And so Bruce is from Oakland, so we're doing a whole thing around Bruce. And so I'm just trying to make sure that it's authentic, that it's told in an original way, and that it is not deliberately academic. I am not an academic at all, and sometimes that shows in my writing. And so I stress about that. But at the same time, one of the things that really matters to me is I'm just like, who do I know for real that knows what's up? If I rewind the clock 20 years, who do I remember cared and was at the shows? Who do I remember wrote the articles? Who do I remember knew the guy that made the beats? You know what I'm saying? And I'm going back to those people. And so a lot of documenting it authentically really means kind of like removing yourself from it and just trying to let the story be, right? And so that's what's really kind of important to me. Just like going back and being brutally honest and being like, you know what? Eric was over there at 4080. He interviewed and saw a lot of people. We need to see what he says. What does he think, right? And, I spent a lot of time in San Jose. In a lot of my hip hop experiences happened inside a San Jose club scene that a lot of people still don't really understand very well. And a lot of their club scene was dictated by the car scene, which started out being the regular old school lowriders, but then turned into lowrider trucks and Jeeps. And that dictated a lot of the hip hop that was played, right? Because it wasn't like New York. It was very different. The cruising scene, even in San Francisco until the '89 earthquake, dude, you used to just cruise that whole strip and you would be in that Broadway tunnel walking between the cars trying to holler at girls, and people were passing mixtapes and everything. It was crazy. That type of stuff was really powerful. The Stone, which is a club that no longer exists, on Broadway. And so I'm just trying to find the people who were there, see what they have, and capture that and share it. Because I think the most important part of all of our experiences, as beautiful as they are, is that it's not about us, right? I'm only just one story. He's only one story. You're all only one story. And it's like this weird kind of democracy / communist thing where none of us matter, but we all matter. And so, you know what I'm saying? Like the songs that, like the other day I was talking to a guy named Dr. Joe Schloss who wrote a book called Making Beats, and he also wrote an amazing book on B-Boys called Foundation. So if you don't have those books, you need to get them. But I'm talking to him, and this is a guy who wrote a book on beat making. I'm talking to him about the Miami bass scene. And we're talking about specifically about a producer named Pretty Tony, and we're talking about artists like MCADE, and we're talking about freestyle, and we're talking about all these different artists. And we're both on YouTube at the same time, and I'm like, all right, go look up Don't Stop the Rock, Pretty Tony. And then he's like, oh, that's crazy. All right, now look up The Party's Just Begun, freestyle. And he's like, oh, and he'd never heard any of that. And I was blown away that he hadn't heard it. But then we had to start talking about the record culture of New York at the time. So I'm talking about it with Brian, and he's telling me that DJ Red Alert wouldn't play anything that wasn't from New York. I believe that. So it explains why all of this stuff that was way better than what the Soul Sonic Force was putting out was never going to get heard. And I was like, makes perfect sense. On top of that, I'm thinking about the Zulu Nation, and I'm knowing like how clicked up all the DJs and stuff are, and I can imagine that just by default, they wouldn't want to play those records. So to me, Miami, LA, and the Bay really carried the entire freestyle electronica music scene until Pretty Tony got popped for cocaine, and then there it was. The whole genre collapsed.
Can I just add? So that was a dope story, by the way.
That was great.
But I just want to go back to the thing about like institutions. And so I think there's a point that needs to be made about institutions, that it needs to be a collaborative effort with the cultural practitioners themselves and or the gatekeepers of that. And I'll give you an example or a case study of that. So some of you might remember, and I think it was 2000 or 2001, when there was a national touring hip hop museum exhibit that came to the Urban Planning Center. Yep. People remember that? Okay, so when that happened, Davey D and I think some other people went to Rene de Guzman, who was the curator of that exhibit and is now at the Oakland Museum. Yeah. And that's our dude. We love Rene. But he basically said, hey, Rene, you know, this is not going to go over well in the Bay unless you have a whole section on Bay Area hip hop there. I mean, it's just not going to be cool. And, you know, but some of that could be because of what you're talking about. Yeah. It's the coastal bias, Red Alert, not wanting to play Bay Area records, et cetera, et cetera. So Rene then, you know, took that under advisement and started collecting all these archives of, or actually he called them artifacts of Bay Area history. So he had like E40 and the Click when they were the Kingsmen. Yeah. You know, or I think they were MVP, right? Mm-hmm. It was they were MVP. Yeah, the Kingsmen was another one with a brother named Quick. Yep. Yeah, who's now Naru. And all this stuff. I mean, like they collected like 40, 80 magazines for me, and so that was like in addition to the wing. And so, you know, if you just leave it up to the academic institution or the museum by themselves to do it, they may not really know what's what and who's who in the culture. And it really has to be a collaborative process. Like they may want to be cool, but they may not know how to be cool. So yeah. I really recommend that, like making sure it's a collaborative process, and don't be afraid to step to them and be like, it's not going to be real unless you do this.
No, that's excellent point, excellent point. So we're not done yet, and we'll go back to talking a little more. Does anyone have any questions in the audience? In Boston, where I come from, where it said, on the window of this house, it said, hella dogs inside this house. Like, so it's basically like, you know, there's a dog in here, but it said hella dogs inside this house, and it was printed out. It wasn't handwritten. And I was just like, yeah, I'm definitely in the Bay, man. There's no doubt. And yeah, of course. I mean, any different kind of region, certainly that you listen to it is like a different accent, a different kind of way of expressing what you're trying to say, for sure. Like it takes a little bit of time if you come from the East Coast. I grew up listening to New York stuff more. So when I was listening to Too Short and the Coup, there's obviously a little bit of a learning curve just to get used to the slang, just because that's not a language I speak in the same way that New York stuff might just be like, huh, you know. So yeah.
I think I think that question has a different answer nowadays than it does for the era that we're talking about now.
Yeah, now.
So now, because music is shipped around in such an easy way, in an instant over somebody's phone kind of thing, there's a ton of examples of newer MCs that come out of a certain region that don't sound anything like what they're supposed to sound like from that particular region. There's a bunch of New York rappers that try to sound like the South, vice versa. There's dudes here back on the West Coast that try to sound exactly like dudes on the East Coast kind of thing. I think those rules don't necessarily apply in the same way that they did during this particular era. But you're absolutely right. Now, it's not quite so easy to differentiate.
Yeah, no, it's a good point.
That's a very prevalent thing that's talked about quite a bit now, that you've got dudes like Joey Badass or whatever, who might have some beats that have a little bit of a New York tinge to it or whatever, but he doesn't really sound like a New York MC in any sort of way at all. So yeah, it's a good point. So.
Yeah.
I think he does.
You think he does sound like a New York
I
MC?
think he is.
I think overall,
He
but
like a modern day buckshot. Not his beats, because obviously there's more pop influence.
Yeah.
But
but
I don't know. I
It might be like, I mean, you could
But
break
I'm
it
a lot
down as far as
smarter
like,
than
yeah, you are a lot smarter.
no, but it is a
But
good
you
point.
Like you could break it down as far as like vernacular and pronunciation and the words that you use kind of thing. But he's got a twang to it that is definitely, I mean, the way that he raps, he has like a little bit of twang to his delivery that doesn't necessarily normally associate itself with New York rappers.
Well-
but that doesn't, I mean, the wording that he uses and the way that he raps might be different, but maybe that's what I'm thinking.
But what would you say though to back in the day, and this kind of maybe also goes to originality and no biting and everything like that, but you definitely didn't hear back in Golden Era in '89, you weren't hearing people from LA or the Bay trying to sound like Big Daddy Kane. And certainly New York rappers were never going to try and sound like someone from the South, whereas now it's kind of like the geography of where you come from doesn't matter as much. There's not as much geographical pride because anyone can put out a record and it goes anywhere. It doesn't start in your neighborhood anymore. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, well, I mean, half the time rappers that come out of their areas nowadays aren't necessarily even trying to talk about the fact that they're from where they're from.
You used to be able to tell also by the beats.
You did.
So you got, okay, that sound, I remember I thought Outkast was from the Bay at first, because I'm like, it sounds like a Cali, like it was too funky to be, and I didn't even think of the South. I was like, it's not New York. That has to be from the Bay, or I was living in Seattle at the time, but you were basically, your sound was the records that you were digging back then. And people aren't digging records anymore. Everybody's using the same software and the same snares and the same synths. So it's like you don't have the regional sounds that you used to have because everybody's using the same sounds. In New York, if you're digging through your dad's records in New York in the 80s, your dad grew up in the 60s, so he collected 60s jazz probably, right? Because jazz was huge in the more urban areas. Whereas if you grow up in LA or the Bay and you're digging through your dad's records from the 60s and 70s, it's going to be a lot of funk that you're digging. Oh, okay, that sounds great. These drums, these synths, this Parliament and the stuff that was more wide open, I guess, like cruising music, like you were saying, you know what I mean? Most people in New York probably were listening on headphones, you know what I mean? A lot less people were listening in their car, whereas like in the East Coast, or the West Coast rather, everybody listens to it in your car. You don't walk anywhere in LA or even the Bay. Let's be real, Bart's garbage, you know what I mean? Like, it's not like up to standard. So people are, I don't know, they're in their car a lot more. So I think, back to your question, I could tell somebody where they're from by the beats back in the day too. I'd be like, oh, that's a New York beat, or you knew that a little bit more, so it was easier to like piece it together. It's funny you were talking about not knowing what the people look like, because I remember the first time we saw Public Enemy like animated, because we'd see photos of them and like it's all, they're in an underground parking garage, and we didn't know, well, which one's Chuck D.
Flavor?
We didn't know who Flavor or Chuck D. I'm like, I think that crazy looking dude was Flavor. And then it was like, I remember actually DJ Design was like, dude, I saw Public Enemy. They were like, it was a video or something. And I was just like, oh my God, what was it like? Because we were so into Public Enemy, but like.
You mean the claymation one?
I don't remember. I don't remember what it was.
Give It Up?
Yeah, I don't remember what it was. I just remember.
So there's
that was way off topic. I'm sorry.
So Zach, I actually have a story about that. I mean, I think you touched on an important point when we're talking about regional differences. That there are differences in environment that come out into the music. Like in New York, everyone was on the subway. Out here, everyone was in their cars, like you said. So the music reflected that. You know, like there were some people walking around with ghetto blasters, like back in the day. You know, but I mean that was like very early before there was even the development of a regional scene. So Boots from the Coup told me a story one time about the making of their first album, Kill My Landlord. Who here does not have a copy of Kill My Landlord?
Raise your hand.
Raise your hand if you do not own a copy. Before you leave this store today, go to the Coup section and get that album. Okay. So Boots told me a story about why the tempos on there are so slow compared to the music that they're making now. And back then they weren't doing that many shows, and everyone was listening on their car. They were trying to get airplay, you know, for people cruising around the lake. But then they started doing a lot more live shows, and it was like, this song isn't going to work for the live performance. We got to like make it something that's a little bit funkier because now we're playing with a live band. We got Uriah Duffy on bass. We got to really do something here.
So, sorry, before anybody interjects, I want to ask you this, Domino, real quick. So, here, hand me the microphone.
I got one. Oh, yeah. Okay. Oh, I can hear you.
No. I want everybody else to hear this. So, so 93 Till Infinity, when it came out, not everybody right off the bat, especially if they didn't really know the backstory or the history behind Hiero, would associate that as a Bay Area record.
Right. Nah. Yeah. Even people from New York thought we were from New York.
Right. Exactly. So, you know, to kind of attach to what we're talking about right here. So that was an interesting thing for a lot of heads around here because there was a lot of cats. I remember having a lot of conversations, and it wasn't the norm, but there was a lot of cats around here that really loved the fact that there was a different sound being exemplified through what it was that you guys were doing versus what was traditionally known as Bay Rap at the time.
Yeah. I mean, I think us and the Far Side had a lot to do with making it okay. You know, okay is, let's just say okay, for people to from the West Coast to do something that wasn't just gangster or mob music. I think that and once we did it, it seemed like there was a lot more groups that kind of felt freedom who probably listened to a lot of East Coast. I mean, the truth is that the majority of the records that we liked were East Coast records.
Right.
And that had a lot to do with it. Right. And that's the influence. Those are the records that I looked for. The sampling was a lot of jazz records, and that's why it ended up like that.
Yeah, but I was gonna. So what the other thing that sorry, before I forget, I just wanted to mention because there was a pretty good handful of records that you guys sampled that were fantasy records, that were Bay Area records.
Yes.
Not everybody knew that, and so still exemplifying the area.
Yeah.
Without necessarily conforming to, whatever the standard sound was of that time, it was still paying homage and still being respectful. And I mean, we all know here, we know Confunction, we know Sly, we know that, all of these different sounds came from the Bay.
Yeah.
And so, for I guess that's the point I'm trying to make is that, there was a lot of kids that when 93 dropped, they welcomed the fact that this was just a different sound. It wasn't like an antithesis to what the Bay was about. It was just different, but it still exemplified what the Bay was about. So
I mean, probably a big percentage of the records we sampled were bought in this store right here.
exactly.
One of the things I wanted to mention was, to this point about regionality and language, when I wrote for The Source way back, I remember talking, and I don't think any of this stuff ever made it in print, but, I would talk to James Bernard, who for a while was a West Coast editor of The Source, and he lived in San Francisco. Well, no. He was from Nashville, but he went to Harvard with Schechter and the rest of them, and after a while he lived out here in the Bay. So one of the things that blew my mind is when I would talk to those guys back east, and this wasn't James, but it was other editors there, is like one of their main complaints about NWA, specifically about Easy, was that they said he sounds too damn country. He was like, he sounds country. And like, to me, being from the West, I was like, what are you talking about? And I remember playing it like, cruising down the street in my 6'4". And I was like, that might sound a little country, you know? And then, so I would really, you know, my grandfather moved out here, and he was one of the first black DJs for what became KDIA. You got to be hella old to know KDIA. All right? So my grandfather was like the first DJ for KD. That's right. All right? And so the thing is, though, is that my father's family is from, you know, Monroe, Louisiana, and from the Magnolia Projects. And the more that I would talk to different rappers, I would ask them where their parents came from, right? West Coast rappers. So like Snoop's parents are from Mississippi, right? And then I remember I was interviewing Spice One, and his mother and Scarface's mother used to go to kindergarten together in Texas. Like, that's insane. So when you start looking at like the West Coast linguistics in rap, like it's all rooted in some twang from the South. You know what I mean? And so it totally explained what was a country thing. Like, to me, it didn't sound country, but that's because we're from the Bay.
You know why that is, though? That's because there was a great migration from the South.
Yep, exactly.
And to the West Coast, and Oakland was actually the last stop on the Transcontinental Railroad. It's interesting that you say Monroe, Louisiana. You know who's also from Monroe? Huey Newton.
Hey.
You know who's also from Monroe?
Who?
Bill Russell.
Hey.
But, you know, the point about, you know, the bias, the regional bias of the East Coast, I think it's a really unfortunate thing. I mean, it sort of prevented them from really feeling the culture that if they didn't completely originate 100%, they pioneered. I remember when I was doing the In the Hood column for The Source, they would send, I did that for like 3 years, right? So they would send me around to like all these different regional spots, right? And one time I went down to like, I think it was Shreveport, Louisiana. And they had like the Mud Bug Fest. Who knows what a mud bug is? That's a crawfish, okay. See, his family's probably from the South. Anyway, so went down to Shreveport and then came back, and you know, the editor was like, well, so who's hot out there? What's the big group? Da 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 da. And I was like, oh, the Hot Boys. Everyone's talking about the Hot Boys. And she straight up said to me, the Hot Boys, that sound like some gay shit. 6 months later, they were on the cover. 2 years later, they were doing crunk nights in New York.
Unbelievable.
We got any questions going on? Go ahead, sir.
You guys would agree that the Bay, I think, ushered in the hard R into hip-hop.
Oh, that's good. Hard R? That's good.
The hard R.
You give that to Usher and not to Chingy? Right there?
Right there.
I mean, the hard, you know, like pronouncing the, you know, the there.
Giving the R, yeah. Like bringing the
The
R.
overpronunciation of
And it affected underground hip-hop. Like,
A lot.
Big
in
time.
general, I think, you know, ubiquitously across the board. Like, underground backpack rap now, it's like that's a thing.
That's true.
Given
That's true.
Yeah.
I think it even made it for, like, the white rappers who really get involved.
Yeah, it's like, all right, I don't have to be from the South now.
You know, I can enunciate properly.
Yeah, you have to do the New York R.
Yeah, exactly.
Or the Southern drawl,
Yeah.
like, you know, the Bay
Yeah.
made it, like,
Yeah.
you know, okay to enunciate.
That Midwest.
I hear it in
Pronounce it the
Dale.
way my English
Yeah.
Dale's
teacher
got
used
his
to tell
own
me to pronounce it.
accent. It's
He
like,
does.
it's like, I don't know. Like,
Yeah.
Dale, you just know, when you hear him.
Yeah, these
talk
guys were
about
trying to
it,
do a
like,
Dell accent earlier today. It didn't go well.
Yeah, it didn't go well. I got some good.
We decided
By the
Adisa
way-
has a solid enough Easy E. but like stay away from Dell.
I've got a great easy and a great rich.
Dell's hard to do his voice. Dell said I was with Dell before I came here. He said he wants a book. Just so you
All
know.
right, I'd be very pleased.
He's a big fan, but he says he only has the one that you read on the iPad, and he wants an actual book.
All right, consider it done. Go ahead, sir.
I was gonna say, I was born and raised in Chicago, so to me, we listen to East Coast and West Coast. Well, I definitely know, like, I was in seventh grade when 93 to Infinity dropped. Vocabulary, that was what the West Coast had first.
Yeah.
Like, and not saying they ain't have vocab East, but the way the delivery of like vocabulary, the way it makes you like, what the fuck did that word mean? Like, we were reading at the time, so it was like it made us grab, dictionaries and books.
That's
just to
deep.
Understand, some of the connections and the wordplay. You know what I mean? Another thing is, like, as far as the regional thing, a little later in high school when Barn Crusher Plus dropped, we didn't know they were from New York. We actually thought they were from the Bay, like especially LP.
That's
Like,
interesting.
I wouldn't have thought LP was a New York MC. And then I guess my last part is, what did y'all think about Common and Twista then? Because like they're Chicago MCs, you know what I mean? And we probably have a different way of how we sound and how we get down on the mic because it's such a variety being from kind of the center. You know what I mean?
I can tell you right now, my DJ experience, Common's first two albums had a crazy amount of love and support out here. Like we played those albums and we dissected his wordplay and the way that he put his songs together.
Yeah, I mean, growing up, just to let y'all know, like, because we were young kids, you know what I mean? We had backpacks.
Yeah, sure.
Resurrection was like a Bible for us.
Oh, no,
Oh yeah, I
absolutely.
can imagine.
I mean, there was a lot of us out here too, man. What's that?
Yeah, no idea.
No idea.
And why not?
Doug.
We were MCs, so like the writing on there was crazy. You know what I mean? But still,
Yeah, his whole thing of saying something that had, another part that was a second part of the sentence tied in
He was
later
sick.
in the bar and all
He
that.
was
I mean,
sick.
we
Yeah.
sat out here and we dissected that stuff in a big way. Man, Common had, I mean, Twista's a little bit different, although his delivery and his like vocal capabilities, we definitely could respect and appreciate that because we had like the fast rap cats out here too that were really into it. But I'm telling you, man, like during my era, Common's first two albums, we could not stop putting his music on mixtapes, on the
he was
radio.
dope.
We would play it at every single event we had an opportunity to, man. Like,
One interesting thing, though, is that Common and No ID both basically are kind of, they didn't think that Chicago appreciated them enough. Like, they didn't think that they got enough love, not from fans, but from the radio and press. They felt like they got it from everywhere else and that they kind of got slept on, which is, Chicago's, as you know, is a complicated town. With music, house stuff obviously is kind of rules more than hip hop, and that complicates things. But what?
Does that ever happen though?
Where you get enough love in your town? In New York, it did. New York, it did. I mean, but
20,000 people come out to Hyro Day every year. That's
Yeah, but it didn't start out that way.
Yeah, dude, I
This is the
gotta.
second time I bring that up, but it's possible. I'm saying.
It's rare though, right?
The thing about that though, Platurn, is that KMEL was in even the Wake Up Show, who I'm good friends with those guys, but Stretch and Bobbito's put us on their show before Sway and Tech, and so like it took a while even for the Bay. Like a lot of people who felt like they knew the scene in the Bay Area were shocked when they found out we were from the Bay. They had never heard of us. A lot, and Dell had already been out. At least the Souls. When the Souls dropped, it was kind of when the whole Hyro thing kind of really took off. But I think there's some truth to what you're saying about the own area doesn't necessarily support, but it also has a lot to do with New York and LA or where the industry is. It isn't in Chicago as much, and it isn't in the Bay, and so. When movements start in those cities, they have immediate impact to radio play and all stuff of that nature.
One thing about Twista, there used to be a thing called the Gavin Convention, It was huge. Every MC and DJ who was really about that life would show up. And so you would go into the Westin St. Francis in downtown San Francisco, and I swear to God, you would go into that lobby and you would see Eric B. and Rakim, KRS-One, Hieroglyphics, Jamalski, Jermaine Dupri, The Brat, Common. You would see everyone just sitting around. It was out of control. My point is, the dude who originally did the Gavin, his name, who was Brian Sampson.
Brian Sampson, yeah.
And so Brian Sampson, the first time I think that Twista was in the Guinness Book for the rapping the fastest, he did that here. He did that in San Francisco at the San Francisco Design Center, because I stood there and watched it happen. You know what I'm saying?
Isn't Twista's first record on is Loud's first record?
I think so.
That first record that he came out, I think, is Loud, Steve Rifkin's first record.
The one with Mr. Tongue Twister? Or is that blah, 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 blah,
Yeah.
Mr. Tongue Twister?
Yeah.
So
he
where it kind of
did that
like
world
it
record.
kind of sounds like Fushnikins on steroids.
And he thought, and you know how there's a song, Dell has a song where he goes, Mr. Twister, get ya, everything a time, and that's from Burnt. Twista thought that Dell dissed him on that song. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah. He wasn't, but I remember he came up, they were talking in one of those conventions, when Gavin was in New Orleans. Yeah. It was like, hey, Dell was like, I wasn't dissing you, I wasn't talking about you.
So speaking of Dell, I think No Need for Alarm is one of the albums that has really it's really ripened over time. Like, it almost sounds better now than it did at the time. Yeah. At least to me. I mean, I didn't give it like a whole lot of heavy rotation at the time, but I go back now and I listen to it and I'm like, man, that's a really dope record. And another thing that really gave me a little bit of appreciation for that was last year at YBCA, they did the Hip Hop Classic, and they focused on the Golden Age, and specifically around 93 and 94. They had all these local MCs, local artists, do classics from that era, and Catch a Bad One was one of them. They also did Black Moon. They did, some KRS and other things like that. And that was another thing that made me think about, well, here's the impact of a culture that, records that I experienced when they were out that are now cycling back 20 years later in a slightly different context by some people that maybe were like 2 or 3 years old when they came out. The Daily Californian actually reviewed that show, and the writer was like, I was 2 years old when this record came out.
Oh, wow.
We're getting towards the end. Last chance for some questions. All right, Steph.
What are some of the other outlets that fans found new music through? Of course, press and commercial radio are really important, but can you touch on, college radio, community radio, DJs at parties and clubs, music video shows?
I have one that I was just talking to about when I was in LA, is that the early Souls of Mischief and High Road demos got circulated throughout the skater community, the Embarcadero skate community in the early 90s via the skater Javante Turner, who had, the early High Road demos, and would basically, that whole community, even before we even had records, well, Dell's record was out, but before the Souls and Casual were out, and had a huge fan base throughout this community based on the fact that they had these demo tapes, and they were circulating and making dubs, and they were talking about, Colin McKay, who's from Canada, had like an 8th generation. It sounded like shit, you know what I mean? And that had a big, and interesting story about that is that we also put an unreleased Souls of Mischief song on a video called Plan B Video. It was like a groundbreaking skateboard video. Mike Carroll, I think, who was basically skating over our song that had never came out. So 93 Till Infinity had came out. We were on the East Coast, and we were doing in-stores, and in a situation like this, signing, and we were in Philadelphia, and this kid goes, man, this record is great, but how do I get this other song? It was a self-titled song called Souls of Mischief, and I was like, where'd you hear that? On this Plan B video. Went to the next city. Album's great, man, but how do I get this song? And it was just like, wow, like these skateboard videos really were super impactful to probably the biggest segment of our fan base is even still a lot of skateboard kids. And yeah, I mean, for us, you know, and it kind of happened. It wasn't anything we did necessarily. It just kind of happened on its own because you know, a couple of skateboarders liked us and skated over our music, and that that was a big deal for us, at least.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of amazing. I mean, I talk about a lot when I'm having conversations and thinking about artists coming up, how important the scene is and your local kind of ecosystem, as I like to call it. And everything has to work together. There have to be radio stations, radio shows. A lot of times in the early days, those are college shows. There have to be local fanzines. There have to be kind of ways that artists can get encouragement and kind of get their sea legs under them and kind of get the word out. Record labels are important, like indie labels who are willing to put them out. Having a studio that was willing to, you know, have them come in and for not much money and kind of, we talked about this a little bit earlier today, like when hip hop was first starting, there were no hip hop studios, there was no such thing. So you were working in a rock studio, or Schoolie D's first stuff was done in a classical studio, you know, and that's why he has some of the reverb, because those are literally like reverb plates from a classical studio, because there weren't hip hop studios. So it's really important in the earliest days, especially, of having a support system, so that, because maybe sometimes some artists would give up, you know, they'd be like, I don't know, maybe no one's feeling this. Maybe I should just kind of pack it in. Maybe this wasn't meant to be. So it's always important that when you do a show, that people show up to it, and there are a lot of people who are responsible for that, beyond the fans. You know, people who are fans, but fans who are willing to go out and preach and talk about how great this stuff is to let other people know, and are in positions, whether it's a fanzine with 1,000 people or a radio show on KMEL or something like that, you know. So, Domino, yeah, you guys should talk about that.
Eric, you probably will tell me if this is true or not, but I heard that Too Short basically got discovered by the major labels when he opened up for the Dope Jam tour at the Oakland Coliseum and basically tore down the house, and all these East Coast artists and East Coast, you know, managers were like, who the fuck is this? Like, basically destroyed it. He was the first one who went on, and I heard that was the thing that springboarded where Jive kind of found out about him or was told about him based on that one performance where, of course, everyone in Oakland knew it was Freaky Tale. It was that era, you know.
Yeah, well, you know, I actually, Latif, I think, was at that show. I think Climax and Zap were on that bill, and it was and he actually talked about that. What he told me was basically that everyone in the house knew all the words that Too Short was saying, even though he was unsigned and independent. And that's when he knew that he could be independent. And, you know, but Too Short actually was a regional phenomenon, but, you know, they didn't have SoundScan back in the days, and he was selling tapes on the 43 bus. Right. You know, and the 40, and making personalized tapes, and just basically, he built a core audience up from nothing, and to the point where the majors actually, you know, they had to sign him because it was kind of like, well, you're doing all of this out here. We go into T's Wowzy Records, and we're like, well, how's you know, the 5 artists that we just put out? How are they doing? Oh, they're doing okay, but well, who's your number one selling artist? Too Short. Who's that? And, you know, it was stuff like that. And going back to what Brian was just saying about the outlets in college radio, so I have to tell the story about how important the Bay was actually in breaking hip-hop as a genre. So back in the day, you had like this whole circuit with Calex, which was right up the street, right up on Bowditch. You had KPOO. You had not so much KDIA. They didn't really play rap. But you had KZSU and you had KUSF. Now, I actually had a show on KZSC, but I'm just talking about the Bay right now, okay? Yeah, I said KPOO, yeah. So at that time, there was only one other black station, and that was what? That's KSOL. That was KSOL, and they did not play hip hop. They would play R&B. They would maybe play Zap, something with a little bit of harder drum, but they had a no hip hop policy. So if you wanted to play hip hop, you had to play it through the college stations. And the college stations out here were breaking hip hop. In fact, Calex won the Gavin Award in 1990 for best hip hop station in the entire country. And because of that, that's actually where the Wake Up Show came out of, and that's actually where why KMEL started playing hip hop was because of the impact of college radio. KMEL was a rock station. And then they said, okay, we're going to do a different format. They didn't call it Hot Urban then, which is what the New York station, Hot 106, what they call it. KMEL actually, started playing hip hop. They started the Wake Up Show because of what Davey D and Kevy Kev and Benny B were doing, and Marcus Clemens out here. And then it became a commercial format, but still the radio stations were like, well, we're not going to play it. Like the Beat in LA was like, we're not going to play it unless KMEL plays it first. So there's the whole industry politics around breaking records. So what ended up happening was that the labels started bringing artists out to the Bay. So like, I remember like Gangstar, Onyx, Arrested Development, people like Nas, like their first release, they would come out and they would do the Bay circuit, and they would do all the college radio stations, and then they would try to get on the Wake Up Show in the hopes of getting on rotation in the Beat in LA. And so that's how it works. So basically, the Bay broke all these New York artists and has never really gotten the full credit for doing that.
All right, we're pretty much out of time, so if anyone's got a last real short question. Yeah, go ahead.
So, what can you tell us, Adisa? What can you tell us about the Oakland Museum that
Yeah, so the Oakland Museum exhibit will open in March of 2018. It's called Respect, Hip Hop, Style, and Wisdom. It will cover hip hop's impact in the following 5 sections. And the impact it's had in chess, in martial arts, in education, in fashion, and in entrepreneurship. So we'll be looking at how has hip hop affected business. And I think that there's no better place to really have that discussion than Oakland. You know what I'm saying? Whether it's short, whether you're looking at 40, whether you're looking at Fab, whether you're looking at Hyro, right? Like we can have...
Looking at also the way that basically the new generation of hip-hop artists utilize every single opportunity that social media has presented itself.
Yeah, the technology and everything else. So it's going to be crazy. So we're looking really forward to that. This weekend, some of the top scholars in hip-hop, including Brian, including Eric, and some others are gathering to start shaking out what exactly the messaging is going to be for every section. And then I expect that you'll see some really powerful things starting to emerge. I don't want to say too much, but we are working on a mixtape for this exhibit. We will probably have some very high-end turntablist performances, and there will be some very powerful video presentation installations that come out of this. And so I'm really excited about it. I'm very honored. And it's also, to be perfectly honest, it's very scary, right? Because, as cool as it might sound, you're like, I cannot blow this. And when I say blow it, what I mean is like, I need to make sure that the people who really put in the work and were there get their acknowledgement. You know what I mean? And one of the things we're also going to be dealing with is we're going to have a tribute to Tupac, Mac Dre, and the Jacka, and we're going to be connecting that to a lot of the psychological trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder that a lot of inner city youth suffer from because they're seeing their friends get killed, because, you know what I mean, so many people are dying unexpectedly, from police brutality or, gang violence and things, and drugs and whatnot. So it's going to be very balanced. And I really hope that myself and everybody else who's involved is able to do hip hop as a whole, but specifically the West Coast and specifically Oakland, the justice that it deserves in its role of the story. Because I don't want Oakland to be the Southern Nubia of this discussion.
Good words to end on. Everybody go out and support that for sure. Yeah, right. I mean, it's your event, so you can talk as long as you want.
One quick comment on just the skate video thing. Like, I can attest to that. I grew up in Southern California, LA area. Skated all through high school. A lot of watching skate videos and hip hop songs over those skate videos. And hung out with a lot of breakers and backpackers and graffiti kids. And the mixtape culture was deep, so that's how we all found out not just New York stuff, but Bay stuff, other LA stuff. So I want to just comment on that. But my question is based on the documenting and preserving sort of the culture, not just the golden age, but where we go in the future, is in the age of technology and where it's easy to document, but seemingly what for? Because it just gets buried in a file somewhere and nobody actually ever looks at it again. What does documenting and preserving look like in the future?
In the digital age? I mean, I think that things can be documented no matter what. Like, so I had a conversation a little while ago with someone who used to work at a publication, like an arts publication in Boston that closed down kind of suddenly. And their archives have been like hard to even find online. And it was the Boston Phoenix. It was like a important alt weekly. And now he runs a blog, more, you know, it's a magazine, lots of followers, et cetera. And he doesn't see, you would think even his articles are hard to find online at the old place, but he didn't seem as concerned even about documenting the stuff on his own website, which I found to be kind of interesting in that you'd think he'd have an extra drive to do something like that. So, yeah, I think that is one thing that is a little bit tricky, is how do you document digital music? I don't know if I necessarily even have the answer to it, but I think in whatever form, it goes back to what we were talking about. If you have the archivist kind of drive to do it, if you have that mindset, and I think that like I was saying before, in like '87, I certainly wasn't thinking like I should save some of this. You know, someday this is gonna be a museum. You're just like in the moment, but there were other people who were thinking like I should save this. You know, because
it is about the curator. It is about curation, especially now because it's oversaturated.
Yeah.
You know, like there's gonna, it's rare to find like an Eric B. and Rakim live picture, but now any concert there's like 50 each night going on. So it's really about the curation and kind of weeding through all the excess and finding out what is the quality work. And that goes for pictures, that goes for music, everything.
Yeah, I mean, but the most important thing is, though, that I would say is that anyone can be an archivist. You know, like it doesn't. You don't have to work in a museum and have a PhD in library science to archive things. Like some of the stuff that ends up in these academic and museum archives is done by average Joe, who just kind of happened to save stuff. Because it's all important. And I personally love the fact that a lot of people are kind of being their own museums and their own archives on things like Instagram. It's pretty amazing. It's actually really powerful in that obviously that didn't exist 20, 30 years ago. That just wasn't, that didn't happen, but it can be very inspirational to kind of look, at least for me, like if I think, and we didn't even get to this part of the discussion about how knowing more about old school golden age stuff can help younger artists to become inspired and to think about like what other people have gone through to make their art and how fortunate they are with whatever's in front of them, whatever capabilities they have, whatever friends they have, whatever technology they have. Because I mean, every generation in 10 years, there's going to be some new technological thing coming along that they're going to look back and be like, man, 2017, that was like the dark ages, man. Like, what was going on?
I really should have saved all those Instagram photos.
Yeah, like I wish I wish I'd taken more selfies, you know. Maybe that won't happen. But anyways, yeah, so I just want to thank all these guys. It's like I said before, a real honor for me just to kind of be in the room with them, and I think this was a lot of fun. So I thank you guys for all hanging out and showing up. Thank you. If anyone is interested in a book, then more than pick one up. I'm happy to sign it.
And I will vouch for this. Anybody that wants to know the stories behind some great albums, particularly in an era where you couldn't find those stories, buy this book and buy the volume 1 and Rakim Told Me as great books.
I appreciate it very much. So yeah, another round for these guys for sure. And thanks to Amoeba for hosting us and Ray and everybody. So this was good. Do it again. Let's do it again soon.